So as I've mentioned, with the centre and with this online series in particular, we're really interested in thinking about how theory and practice come together. Um, all of this work is about material transformation. But one of the key questions we've been thinking about within the centre is whose theory and whose practice? How can we better connect as a UK higher education institution with racial justice efforts happening in the global south? Within UK universities, there is much talk of anti-racism and decolonization, but there is a general failure to cite, platform, or collaborate with knowledge producers and activists outside of Europe and North America. This not only perpetuates historic power imbalances, whose knowledge is valued and made accessible, but also limits understanding of how the major issues relating to colonialism, capitalism, patriarchy, and climate crisis are expressed across the globe and what action is needed to combat them. With this in mind, I was very happy when Tete proposed running this event with Dr. Mordecai Ogada. It is a great opportunity to learn more about the ongoing impact of colonialism on Africa's natural resources, with a specific focus on conservationism and water. I won't say too much more about this as I will allow the two speakers to introduce their topics. But I do just want to reiterate how pleased we are to have both Tete and Dr. Ogada with us today. We are really looking forward to hearing your insights shortly. But before I do turn to Tete, I just want to cover a bit of housekeeping. As you know, today we have two talks. But once those are completed, we'll have a very short break and then we'll return for some audience questions so you can enter into the conversation. We do encourage you to consider the power dynamics of the space when posing a question. We really want this to remain a respectful discussion about what some would consider a difficult and complex issue. I'll reiterate this nearer the time, but the way to pose questions is to either raise your hand or to add comments in the comment section. I do ask as well that everyone keeps their microphones muted just so we don't disturb the speaker presentations. It's up to you whether or not you want to have your video on. If you want to leave the space for any reason, then please do feel free to. So with that being said, let me please introduce the first speaker, Tete Mausse, who will be sharing her research on water access in Africa. And she will also be speaking to the significance of Dr. Ogada's work. Tete is a final year PhD candidate at the University of Sheffield and Grantham Scholar, specializing in human geography with a focus on urban waters in the global south, with current and former experience in academia, media, and business roles in diverse international organizations and locations. Thank you so much, Tete, for putting this together, and welcome to today. Over to you.
Yeah, Alex, and hello, everybody. First and foremost, thank you very much, Alex, for hosting us and warmly embracing this event. Secondly, to the Center for Equity and Inclusion that I more than enjoy partnering with. And then to extendedly to the Grantham Center for their support throughout this endeavor, and everybody else who has joined and has helped to share this event. Thank you. So here we go. So first slide, Alex. In the corridors of scholarship, colonial and decolonial discourse is once again rife. It is not an easy topic, as views of development and realities vary widely. My work confronts colonial structures, and I paraphrase, by as Gandhi reminds us, to trace the history of water systems helps us to understand the development of any city. This city is Maputo City in Mozambique, a sub-Saharan 50. These are African cities whose water supply stagnates around the 50% mark. Maputo is currently at 56%. If Africa is going to achieve its Sustainable Goal 6, the stagnations of water provision must be unsilenced, silence being a pernicious legacy of colonialism. The literary angle of today's exploration coincides with the post-colonial tenets of Smiley and Hungerford's comparative study of phonetic colonial legacies, where they acknowledge that water was and remains a colonial tool of division and power. Joe and Akiwumi affirm this position in their advocacy for micro-level interrogations of water provision as a development indicator in African states. I further find inspiration in Frantz Fanon's thesis of desire, which frames the ideas of social subjugation, separation, and imaginations, which manifest into the lived experiences of the city dwellers of Maputo and other sub-Saharan cities alike. I begin by looking at the historical purpose of organized water. Alex, if we could please move on to slide 3. The next slide, thank you. So I begin by looking at the historical purpose of organized water. Water was originally structured to efficiently supply large and clean volumes to industries during the first industrial era. Water distribution to households came as a byproduct that also served to benefit councillors as a form of municipal income generation, hygiene management, which was becoming a major concern as globally more and more cities became condensed. And it additionally provided benevolent political scores of serving the city dwellers. Modern water supply is thus capitalistic in nature and not driven by the humanitarian principles that are enshrined by the United Nations Human Rights today. The next slide, please, Alex. African cities were built to meet the European visions of modernity in Africa. The next slide, please, Alex. The master plan of the city was a boundary guide of belonging, and where water plan ended, and the master plan of the city was a boundary guide of belonging, and where the water plan ended, so did the city master plan, not the other way around, as infrastructure was planned before cohabitation. Water distribution borders were thus an important and official tool of social divide and colonial positioning and privileges. This was informed by sentiments uttered by the then British governor of Nairobi as a question of whether African people needed water and if they even deserved it. Next slide, please. Post-independence, African institutions continued this bias through the development priorities of urban service delivery and the proportionality problem. This is where I highlight the water divide, the proportionality problem. Capitalistic upstream projects such as dams. The next slide, please, Alex. Oh, and before we move to the next slide, so I just wanted to highlight the next 2 slides. So this one is a colonial picture of settler colonials during the day, lavishing away and enjoying the spoils of being a settler colonial in Africa. Whilst moving on to the next slide, Alex, during the day, before and as it continues today, as you can see, the local natives slave away. So we can now jump onto the slide that shows the dam. So capitalistic upstream projects such as dams are favored over downstream individual household supply. These are very lucrative. The image of the dam. The next one, yes, there. Capitalistic upstream projects such as dams are favored over downstream individual household supply. These are very lucrative to capital and handshakes as the procurement of building materials butters a wide supply chain. We never think about how much supply chain actually goes into the building of a dam. How many corporations get to render profits from the building of a dam versus if we're just putting a few pipelines downstream into individual households. Continuing with capital, what is the proportionality problem in reference to capital? Well, historically, water was a settlement draw for the province of Maputo, since at face value, it is water bountiful. The black curse is now the blue curse. Maputo has 4, moving on to the next slide, Alex, please. So Maputo has 4 major rivers that flow out into the Maputo Bay, which stretches across the city coast, and runoff waters are captured in aquifers, otherwise known as subsurface water. In the past decade, what I like to call the new hectoliter rush of manufacturers have furthered the competition for water between capital and public interests. This capital includes beverage companies. Currently, 4 of the world's biggest producers are consuming millions of hectoliters of surface and subsurface water in Maputo. Namely, some of these companies are Diageo, Anheuser-Busch, Heineken, and so forth. They are situated in the new prime water zones, and although their new locations have reduced the water stress of the city, as some of them shifted from the city, this has also invited new manufacturing interests into the city and ecological challenges where they are. High water yielding agriculture such as maize, sugar, cassava farms, which mainly supply raw materials to these beverage companies, are also a further competitor into the water streams of Maputo. And then you also have the likes of mineral companies. Yet only the benefits of economics seem to matter. In colonial times, it was a case of where and who you were to receive distribution. Today, water distribution is about where, who, how much, and from where. So the criteria for satisfactory access to water has expanded, furthering the divide between the haves and the have-nots in urban water supply. The water divide extends to the proportionality of cleanup, sanitation. Alex, if we can please jump to the slide that has the man walking by the drain. Okay, I'll continue. This is a dire sub-Saharan city challenge that is also observed in developed cities like Johannesburg. Consequential to the historical perspective of the indigenous and their deserving of hygiene. The investment in the entire water and sanitation apparatus reflects this, especially in the development of adequate sanitation. Moving on to the next slide, Alex. This challenge is really pronounced during periods of extreme climate crisis, as we're experiencing now, like the recent floods of the East African cities of Maputo, Nairobi, and Dar es Salaam. The water proportionality problem is further experienced in the daily presentation of deserving water. What Fanon referred to as the natives' obsessive desire of the colonial dream place that denotes the overcoming of oppression and poverty. We see this in social and environmental spaces such as, the next slide please, Alex. The swimming pool rush that's taking place all over the city of Maputo, even in underprivileged and water-scarce communities, and this creates further micro-proportionality challenges. And as you can see in the pictures, these are not so small swimming pools. Moving on to the next slide, we've got grand fountain displays in commercial and non-commercial areas. And then moving on to the next slide, we also have home extraction and purification systems, hence private domicile boreholes. We've got large private water storage facilities, but the staff housing will rely on bucket butts. And private use lakes, on to the next slide, Alex, and private use lakes in conservation areas like Lake Nakuru in Kenya. In closing, the water divide refers to the gaps that linger on in the water provision structure of African cities. I have put forth some insights of my study today and what Dr. Ogada will follow up from with a powerful presentation to further highlight silenced African resource commodities, experiences, and colonial legacies. Today's event is one of many important opportunities to internationally platform underrepresented grassroots situations and dialogues through the gramophone of Western organizations to drive interest and inclusive sustainable solutions for the Global South. Please do tweet about this. I thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tete. That was a really rich presentation, and there are a couple of things I'd like to expand on when we get to the discussion, and I'm sure audience members will want to comment as well. But before we get to that, I'm really pleased to invite our next speaker, Dr. Mordecai Ogada, um, who is a Kenyan carnivore ecologist and conservation policy scholar with over 20 years experience in conservation practice in Kenya and other parts of Africa, mainly on human-wildlife conflict issues. His current work focuses on the challenges of racism and other prejudices in the global conservation arena, an area where he consults for various international organizations. He is also researching and writing on the ethical challenges of the global climate movement, including the protection of the ownership rights of indigenous people in the global south over their natural heritage. He is currently the director of Conservation Solutions Africa, a natural resources consultancy based in Nanyuki, Kenya. So, Dr. Ogada, really pleased to have you here with us today. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me clearly. Sorry, I've had a really bad flu, so my voice might not be as clear as I want it to be. Let me just get my screen share on. Okay, I hope everyone can see my screen.
We can see it.
Okay, thank you. My talk's entitled About Us, the Role of Academia in Normalizing and Cleansing Exclusion. The reactions to talks about exclusion and prejudice, like what Tete just said, what Tete just illustrated to us, is usually discomfort or embarrassment, because some people are uncomfortable because they feel guilty, because they didn't think they were doing something wrong. And others are embarrassed because they were actually doing it and deliberately and being called out. And this is because we've normalized it. That's why when someone speaks about it now, it seems strange when you talk about it, because it's been normalized. So this talk will be about the various experiences and perspectives I've gone through, both in the area of academia and in my research work and in my teaching work as well. Okay, I'm a conservationist, so we all familiar with the popular concept of national parks, which in fact, despite being very popular, it's a very primitive conservation tool. Who is the protected areas? Who is the area protected from? Because this is the IUCN definition that's widely accepted around the world today, a space recognized and managed through legal or other effective means. Note that red font illustrates the part where a lot of human rights violations happen to achieve long-term conservation. So this basically means it's an area that's protected from its owners. So it's taken away from its owners. A protected area in Kenya is protected from Kenyans. Protected area in Tanzania is protected from Tanzanians, with the presumption that they are the threat to the wildlife. Yet the wildlife existing there is a simple proof that they are not. So where did this ludicrous idea came from? It came from Roosevelt, president of the United States in the late 19th century. And he came up with this idea basically started this by ejecting Native Americans from huge areas to form Yellowstone, Yosemite, and other national parks in the US. And he did a famous safari to Africa, Kenya, in fact, in the early 20th century. And that's where he brought in the romance of African wildlife, the romance of seeing the African wildlife, romance of slaughtering the African wildlife, and the romance of subjugating Africans. If you look at the documentation about his safari, it shows they killed numerous animals, total of 5,000 some animals, including many endangered species that are still on display in various museums in the United States. And the aroma of subjugation, you had these columns of local people walking hundreds and hundreds of miles, carrying really heavy stuff, ivory tusks, guns, ammunition, cooking gear, supplies, etc., etc., etc. And these were indentured laborers. And Roosevelt himself was an unashamed racist. So you can imagine the treatment these people got. There are many photos of them crossing on foot through rivers while Roosevelt and his crew are on horses, etc., etc. But this sort of cemented, early 20th century cemented the Western image of Africans and the role of Africans in the wild, with their wildlife and the landscapes. And it also cemented the white savior, white hunter, white conservationist, white hero narrative. Shortly after this, when the first volumes of the Legend of Tarzan was published. So the arts are also important in creating these paradigms in our minds. So as a scientist, I can tell you that we need to in order to protect our environment, or conservation should be protection of species, systems, and livelihoods, not protection of geographical areas. Protection of geographical areas is ancient thinking, like when they built the Great Wall of China or Hadrian's Wall and this kind of thing. Walls and barriers, by definition, are violence. And violence occurs wherever in the world where there are hard walls. Talk of North and South Korea, the Berlin Wall before it came down. You have walls in Gaza, Israel. And walls and barriers are definitions of violence. So we cannot use that in creating sustainability. So John Speke, one of the celebrated historical quote-unquote explorers who is said to have quote-unquote discovered so many features in East Africa, including Uganda, and admired for how far he walked across the continent. In old artworks like this, you see him being carried on a parasol across this distance. But these images survive because today in Uganda, tourists are still carried in this manner, going to see gorillas in Bwindi National Park. And it's acceptable, it's normalized. You can see the lady wearing very nice hiking boots, but she will not step on the ground. These absurdities have become normal in conservation and tourism. So it's a form of colonialism or continuation of colonialism. So the new colonialists are not empires like British Empire, etc., but they're capitalist interests. And by capitalist interests, I mean the big wealthy people who fund research. Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Hans-Jörg Wyss, Richard Branson, these people that we call heroes. They're funding their interests is not out of love for students or animals or anybody else. It's self-actualization. And the colonies are not longer countries that are defined by borders, but sectors and resources. Someone sort of wants to express ownership over an elephant population in a given place because he funds research on that. And over a certain forest because he funds research on that. And these are in the global south. So this is the danger, because it's normalized. This is the danger we must sort of wake up to now. So broadly speaking, what are the colonies? Protected areas, national parks, yeah. Renewable energy. There's so much nonsense and oppression that goes on in Africa under the umbrella of renewable energy and this greenwashing campaigns. This includes carbon offsets, carbon credits, carbon trading, which is money laundering on a global scale. But unfortunately, which comes with it, the annexation of lands in the global south. Export-based agriculture is another lesser one, but resource rights is a major thing. Certainly when indigenous people cannot access certain water sources, sort of water colonialism, similar to what Tete just spoke about. And then there's media, this very powerful propaganda, and the oppression of Black people by conservation interests is very much normalized by propaganda. And what's the propaganda? The propaganda is like Richard Attenborough's documentaries, wonderful high HD photography of African wildlife, but never shows a Black person, even though it's in Africa. So Attenborough never has to say that Black people have no place in the conservation sector. He doesn't have to say that, and he never says that. He lets the camera say it for him. And if those documentaries inspire you to come to Africa, you will be disappointed when you come to Kenya and find people, where you expected only wildlife and landscapes. So when talking students, I'm not sure how, if you're all or how many of you are students, but people talking about conservation students, they need to ask themselves this very fundamental question of what existed before the savior, the white savior. And what if the savior didn't come or doesn't come? Because so much of our history in terms of conservation, resource use, etc., it's narrated from the first time a white person got involved in it. You'd think conservation started with Roosevelt's visit to Kenya. You'd think we had no history before colonialism, and it's suppressed like that. That's why we have these narratives coming through even in education and in academia, in spaces where we should have more intellectual flexibility. So it's important that students ask themselves these questions so they have their answers and make peace with them before they get into their careers. There was a World Conservation Congress in Marseille, in France, a couple of years ago, and they came up with this bizarre colonial plan called the Nature Africa Initiative, where they identified landscapes and seascapes, those you see marked on the map, that will be funded. They said funded, but earmarked to be taken over, to be controlled by Europe, under the guise of conservation easements, carbon trading, protected areas, etc., etc., etc. And it's a colonial plan, and it was there in plain sight. It's supported by the EU because it's environmentally friendly. It's supported by the UN because it, quote unquote, addresses climate change. And it's supported by several wealthy capitalists who will invest in it and get their own little pieces of these colonies. And you see the protected areas and seascapes do not follow national boundaries. So these are the new colonies. They don't follow national boundaries for the old imperial colonies. They have their own boundaries, and they're flexible and shape-shifting. That's why they're even more of a threat and hard to address in terms of legal and justice terms. So conservation in the West, how it's presented to you people in the UK, in Europe, in the United States, it's a left-wing pursuit. So it's liberal, peaceful, green, inclusive, proletarian, and something everyone wants to be part of. But when in Africa, the same people, same organizations are right-wing, they're conservative, they're exclusive, they're militarized, violent, they're uniformed, they're intrusive, oppressive, and often racist. This is the truth of the matter. WWF is not that cuddly panda toy you get when you donate some money for it. They're brutal, cruel guards in Central Africa and East Africa. The Nature Conservancy is taking land from Africans every day. Even now, as we speak, they're taking so much land in Kenya. They've taken the entire seascape around the Seychelles. And this is the truth. And it's important that we hold conservation organizations and interests to the same standards we hold everyone else. And lies get told to maintain the exclusion. This was a poster produced by the David Sheldrick Wildlife Trust, which is based in Kenya, and was run by Daphne Sheldrick, who was honored by the Queen. She passed away a few years ago. And they had created this crisis narrative where they said one African elephant is killed every 15 minutes. And at this rate, none will be roaming wild by 2025. We are now in 2024. I can guarantee there'll be African elephants roaming wild next year. But this justified the human rights violations. This justified the shoot-on-sight orders for anyone seen near elephants. This justified arrests, displacements, etc., in the name of conservation. And obviously, the crisis justifies the flow of dollars and euros and pounds. The other thing is the translocation of wildlife or use of wildlife as displacement tools. This has been perfected by African Parks, the organization of which Prince Harry is the president. They move rhinos all over the place. And wherever they move rhinos, they get land. They get license to fence it. They get license to have arms to protect it. They get license to displace people. This was an incident in Kenya where this one particular one was done by WWF, claimed to be saving rhinos by moving them from one place to another, 2018. And all the rhinos died because they were placed in new habitats where they couldn't find water and other things. But why the translocation? It's not like rhinos were overcrowded anyway. And we know rhinos are endangered, so there's no overcrowding. It was to transfer power from conservation power from Kenya Wildlife Service to WWF because they created new sanctuaries that were not managed by Kenya Wildlife Service. Now, this was being done by Lewa Conservancy, which is another famous conservancy in northern Kenya, very closely linked to Prince William. They were transferring rhinos as well to community lands in northern Kenya and creating conservancies. Once rhinos are put in, people have to be kicked out because we don't want you to poach the rhinos. And as you can imagine, on the advice of scientists, the rhinos are always placed in the areas where there's permanent water, where there's the best grazing, etc., areas that the communities need to use, especially during dry seasons. This is in northern Kenya, and the green area shows where the rhinos were translocated to. The hard black line is a fence. So you can imagine people going from the south to the north. You've added about 20 kilometers to their journey if they just need to go to a market or to see their relatives or to go to school or hospital, whatever. That interruption, the violence of fencing across human landscapes. So the root of this malaise, philosophically, is the thought process that grew conservation out of exploration by colonialists, Speak, Roosevelt, and those others, and exclusion of indigenous people. That's what conservation says. Conservation has a mantra in Africa now. African wildlife is in peril, and the source of danger is Black people. So conservation in Africa has to seek to control, restrict, and oppress Black people, or they'll kill all the wildlife. And then the white people will have nothing to enjoy. So exclusion in conservation practice requires violence. This is why we have even NGOs now having armed militias guarding protected areas in human landscapes, in people's homes. There's extrajudicial killings happening even in Kenya and other parts of Africa. Congo is particularly notorious, as is South Africa. We have a fence going up around Mount Kenya forest. That's the nature of the fence. So you can imagine people who need to go into the forest to collect wood, fuel, medicinal plants, to pray at sacred sites, etc. They can't get through this. And this is all under the umbrella of conservation. It requires dishonesty because none of this can be done if you're telling people the truth. So billionaires pretend to love environment and grab huge chunks of land, calling themselves conservationists. This gentleman is called Jochen Zeitz. He's German, and he's got around 100,000 acres of land nailed down in Kenya and South Africa now, and is still expanding further. This is Hans-Jörg Wyss. He's Swiss. Again, he's donated 1 billion to the Nature Conservancy, also to grab so many acres in East Africa, particularly Kenya. Richard Branson, same thing in southern Kenya. Jeff Bezos is in on the game now as well. So they're all getting there, and it's all self-actualization and capitalist greed. There's nothing altruistic about these people's intentions. So we end up having protests as people lose their livelihoods, etc. And the whole charade of carbon credits. In the history of man, there's never been a time that such a flimsy lie has been told and accepted by so many people, governments, and global bodies. The idea that you can fly around Europe and have X carbon emissions and mitigate that by planting some trees in Kenya or Malawi is ludicrous, but people buy it. If you mess up the River Thames, planting trees in Kenya won't help you. You have to clean up the Thames. That's the environment, the simple facts. But the propaganda around this is so strong that this gets accepted. And the bad thing is that the sheer amount of money behind it normalizes or smoothes the way for rights violations. Again, it requires kings. Let me, those are, let me just skip those. And you see people like Edward Wilson came up with the so-called half-earth theory. This famous academician from Harvard. The idea that 50% of the earth should be conserved for biodiversity seemed like a harebrained scheme, but it was accepted. The UN, granted, they reduced the figure slightly, so we have now the 30 by 30 program that aims to have 30% of landscapes and seascapes under protection by 2030, has been adopted globally. And you can imagine the amount of violence that will be required to do that. Look at Jane Goodall, you all know her. These are the so-called conservation heroes and icons in African conservation. Jane Goodall, you have the late Diane Fossey, you have Daphne Sheldrake, you have Ian Douglas Hamilton, you have Sir David Attenborough. And those, however, you don't have any Black people amongst those. They're all white, they're all European. Yet there are Black people, many of them who you don't even know, who live in peace with wildlife, in peaceful contexts. This is a small town near the Masai Mara called Talek. And this eland just hangs around with people and no one bugs it, and people just take photos of it and they enjoy its company. This is in northern Laikipia, near where I live. There's this giraffe that comes and checks out all the buses of it. A lot of the buses carry vegetables up there, so it wants a bite of vegetables, but no one bugs it. And it's become this attraction to travelers on that route. This is also northern Laikipia, another very tame giraffe. This is Naivasha in southern Kenya. And this is Bazule in Burkina Faso. They have crocodiles at their totems and they hang around with them. Kids play with them, they feed them and all that. But this is Nigeria. This is Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. These are the sort of pictures you won't see in National Geographic because they show Africans living in a peaceful context with wildlife. And this narrative doesn't sell. So what you usually see is Prince William telling people that poaching is a problem, while at the same time contradicting himself by saying sport hunting can be a conservation tool. Ridiculous elitism. In communication, we have normalization of these terms. When white people eat meat from wild animals, it's called game meat or venison. When Black people eat it, it's called bushmeat. White people hunting, Black people poaching. White people exploring, Black people encroaching. White people livestock are ranchers. Black people are herders. Travelers and nomads. People with identities. Communities without individual identity. Those are Black people. You'll see this in literature. And this is the challenge we face, the normalization of this. So we call this habitat encroachment. Yet we call this a riding safari. Yet one is a livelihood activity, the other is a lifestyle luxury activity. You have documents like this saying that Kenya is protecting the wildlife. Well, an animal keeper spending the night in a stable with a wild animal instead of with his family is not, there's nothing positive about that. But it's accepted that in the conservation picture, Black people are there as the sort of tools and bystanders. So how can we escape this? Academia must develop new standards and definitions. The old ones are obsolete now. We must entrench indigenous livelihoods and aspirations in conservation discourse. We must partner with the humanities. Conservation, not biology. We must partner with history, anthropology, political science, etc. Human population should be removed from the conservation discourse completely. And new communications must be found because the peer review model is outdated. It keeps us in these boxes and it is a tool of repression. These are examples of how problems the peer review model. Someone wrote this paper that European colonizers killed so many indigenous Americans that the planet cooled down. Not to mention that the substance of it is probably rubbish. But how did an editor accept something so racist and prejudiced for publication? And this is not the 1940s, this is 2019 when this was published. Nature recently published a study about the number of trees per capita for people around the world. And they came up with this graphic to illustrate it. You see Canada #1, Greenland #2, Australia #3, United States #4. So the top 4 are all settler colonies. Then you have France. Then the first African country is Ethiopia, with significant deserts and high human populations, and China, UK, India. How Democratic Republic of Congo is not here, or Gabon, or Cameroon, or Liberia? They'd be #1. But you see, nature can't have that, because that would imply that Black people know how to conserve forests. And nature doesn't want to sell that narrative. Same with livestock. You see, science all over the world is now neglecting the pollution from planes, machines, nuclear power stations, everything in the West. And they're now pointing a finger at Africa's herds of livestock as threats to the global environment or cause of global warming. This justifies the use of violence to drive pastoralists off their land, which has happened in northern Tanzania. Not to mention that in northern Tanzania, they're being driven off to make room for hunting, which is, for some strange reason, is considered conservation. It's been terrible, and we have conservation refugees now in southern Kenya who fled from this violence and violation of human rights. The UN has said nothing because this serves their 30 by 30 aims. It's been terrible violence, and I'm sorry to show that picture, but that's the reality. In northern Tanzania, this is a camp in southern Kenya where these people are being registered. So the 30 by 30 is a call to violence. It should be rejected in total, because I've never seen any place where they're talking of expansion of Regent's Park in London by 30%. It's always about Serengeti, Mount Kenya Park, Savo Park, where we Africans live. Again, India is not excluded. They talk about methane from Indian livestock causing global warming. In India as well, you have these posters. I noticed this poster where it's telling people to stop encroaching on wildlife habitat. And the people being ejected from here are Divasis who've lived in those forest areas for many generations, millennia. And if you look closely, you'll see the difference in complexion between the forest guards and the suspected criminals. So the racism is there wherever you go in the global south and encounter conservation initiatives. Again, trying to control birth control population as a conservation tool, something that would never be accepted anywhere else in the world, is applied in Africa. So application of technology in conservation requires intellect and humanity, which we currently are not applying. We are making renewables, the wind farm in northern Kenya, but if you see, it's not very clear. They fenced off the land for the turbines. Why do you need to fence off land for turbines? People need to graze their animals there, and they could do with the turbines running. Everyone's proud of electric cars, but no one talks about the abuse of kids in the coltan mines in Congo, where 98% of the coltan comes from. So there's no clean coltan. I've never seen a kid being abused in an oil drilling facility. So I'm fine with petrol, thank you very much. The regard towards Africa as a continent that has to be colonized, cannot be left free, is alive and well in Europe even today. So Europe thinks their declining power in Africa means China is taking over. No, it just means Africa is waking up, and we don't need to be controlled by anyone. We need to be partnered with, we can trade, etc., visit. And this is why academia, especially in the United States, has a strange faculty position called Africanist. I've gone around many universities in the US, they have Africanists. I've never met one who's actually African. But we've adopted this in Kenya. In Kenya, we have University of Nairobi has a Department of African Studies, which is ridiculous. What is African studies to an African? And they tout these things. Harvard University calls itself one of the foremost centers of learning about Africa. Really, in Massachusetts? How can that be? And again, Princeton, they say Africa is the continent where our future will be determined. Both cultural and natural resources, which basically this is an extractive perspective. It's more honest, but nevertheless unpleasant. Stanford University, the Ivy League schools, colonial experience provides us with a shared framework. So we need to relate with Africa in a colonial manner. It's appalling, but this is in academia, and these are from their websites. So they pose narratives like Africa Day, USA Africa Summit, Safari Tourism is another narrative. The arts fiction, I told you about Tarzan, Attenborough, Born Free, those movies, The Lion King. The sustainability narrative, we understand sustainability because our livelihoods have always depended on the lands and waters where we live. So we understood that, and we are the cradle of mankind. So sustainability cannot be manufactured in Europe and Africa. How can our understanding of the Black world escape from this? Develop standards, I said, partner. Also, those in the arts partner with the sciences. Again, tourism removed from any intellectual discourse. And the Black economy should be globalized as a concept. The economy that utilizes natural resources directly. The fruits of this narrative are default extractive thinking like Princeton University, granting rather than repairing. Risky applications of global tools developed to exclude the Black political economy. The global loss of Black heritage and disenfranchisement of Black people all over the world. Climate and heritage colonialism, where the people who've destroyed, the nations who've destroyed the global climate are now the ones imposing climate rules on the rest of the world. Microcolonialism is what happens in these small colonies. It requires state capture. The COP26, this is first of all, this is at State House, Kenya, former President Uhuru Kenyatta. The gentleman standing behind him is called Max Graham. He's a graduate of Cambridge, started some organization called Space for Giants. And next to him is Yevgeny Lebedev, a Russian oligarch based in the UK, who finances him. And they were securing an agreement for all sorts of lands for conservation, while Lebedev is offering concessions for various various mineral explorations in those lands. And on the right is the late Richard Leakey, again, famous conservationist. This is Lebedev again in Scotland, COP26, lecturing President Kenyatta and his members of his cabinet on what he wants from Kenya in terms of green financing agreements and this kind of.
I think we may have lost Dr. Ogada. Is it just me that can no longer hear him speaking?
I think we did lose him.
Okay, thank you. I will try to, I think he may try to reconnect. In the meantime, as Dr. Ogada is just reconnecting with us, if anybody wants to take a short break, we were going to move into the discussion quite soon. So it's a good opportunity if anybody does need to get a rest from the screen, as we will be moving straight from Dr. Ogada's talk to the Q&A. Hopefully he'll be able to rejoin us very shortly.
Hi, Alex. Can you hear me?
Sorry, did you lose? I lost my link.
We lost your connection, but that's okay. We can hear you now. It's fine.
Oh, okay. Yeah, just have, let me just put up the slide share because just concluding.
So Alex, in Kenya, there's a terrible internet connection problem.
Yeah, it's really bad right now.
It's a current problem that the networks are experiencing.
Okay. You can see my screen, okay?
Yep, that's great.
Yeah, so publications like this have started to emerge, bringing out the truth about this. This was by the Oakland Institute about the Nature Conservancy's violence in northern Kenya. I also co-authored a book, The Big Conservation Lie, with environmental journalist called John Barry a few years ago, and I also run a YouTube channel, and there's my website there where I share some of these things. But it's important that everyone comes up with their own channels to bring this out, because the normalization barrier is not easy to overcome, especially for students. It requires courage, but it's important that we do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm glad that your internet connection held on as long as it did, because
Yeah.
that was so rich, and I made so many notes. I don't want to hog the time that we have left by sharing my own reflections, but just as a headline, I think the role of academia in what you've described was really significant to me, and I think the audience being, I would imagine, largely from an academic background, I think that's going to be really key to conversation. And also the linkage that you made between capital, race, and the climate crisis was an important reminder that those are interlocking systems. But you explored an area that I'm personally not as familiar with when it comes to that interlocking network. So I took a lot from that. Thank you very, very much. As you had just disconnected, I had mentioned to the people gathered here today that they could use the time for a short break, because I'm quite keen to transition now into a discussion with the remaining half an hour, because I imagine there will be questions and discussion points people want to engage with. That being said, I think it's the time really to open it up to audience. And if anybody would like to ask a question of the two speakers, please could you let us know by either raising your hand or putting something in the comments section, and I can read the question out if that's preferable. So yeah, thank you so much, Tete, Dr. Ogada. Over to the audience, if you'd like to add anything.
Hey, I have oh, sorry.
Mariam, I can see a hand raised. Do you want to ask a question?
Yes, thank you. Hello. Thank you, Tete and Professor Mordecai, for both of your very moving and very valid points. Just a quick, I'm a postdoctoral researcher that studies decolonial approaches to the climate transition and the hypocrisies of the climate transition, and inequitable resource distribution and the effects on people's lives, especially in Central Africa. I did my PhD research in DR Congo. So your points were very true, and we see a lot of the points that you made in the Virunga National Forest in DRC and what you said about billionaires, for example. Howard Buffett bought vast amounts of land to gain control of the hydroelectric power of Virunga National Park. And as you know, anyways, I wanted to ask you, because you're both the experts here. In my work, I struggle whenever I use the word colonialism, and we've seen it, green colonialism, climate colonialism, extractivism. Whenever I use it, I get some critique and pushback, both by Western and African scholars, that says when you kind of reuse a word that was established for a certain time period in a certain system, you are also taking away, again, the voices of Africans themselves, and silencing, both the good and the bad, and, the complicity of perhaps certain leaders who are partnering with capitalist, imperialist, strategic partners in order to kind of continue this capitalist colonialism system. So I just wanted to ask you how you balance that and what you recommend as a way of moving forward that shows, no, this is colonial, but maybe in a language. And I really liked your point about communication. How do we communicate in a way that also says, brings back voices to Africans? Thank you.
Maybe I can make a couple of remarks. Okay, it's a very difficult thing, so there aren't any really proven methods. Depends who you're dealing with. But first of all, you will find that in Africa, when you push against colonialism, you are likely to get the strongest opposition from African scholars who are beneficiaries of that colonialism. Because colonialism always requires collaborators, and collaborators tend to be even more invested in colonialism than the imperialists themselves. So you will get pushback. It's important to, especially when you've written something, if someone asks you to change it in a certain way, do not discard. Sometimes you don't have a choice. Maybe you're a student, it's your thesis. You've been told to remove this or change this. You don't really have a choice. But keep that and let it out through another channel, whether it's a blog, whether it's just YouTube videos, whatever it is, or you write it out in your own sort of report. Because that's the wonderful thing about the internet. It's created this space where I can write something and answer the president of the US or anything like that. So I think it's important that there is pushback. There is pushback because what you are saying is important. And the capitalists are very, very powerful, particularly in academia, because now they're giving grants to research organizations. In the US, they're funding department chairs, etc. It's to advance their narrative. So it's not easy, but don't discard any information you have. And even if you keep it for 5 years, make sure it comes out through whatever platform will accept it. But don't be surprised, don't be challenged that maybe you're European or maybe you're from somewhere else and an African scholar comes and tells you, don't tell us about colonialism. Colonialism is thematic, and imperialism is not about color. There are many Black imperialists in Africa. There are more Black imperialists in Africa than white ones, actually. So you're likely to get more pushback from those ones. And when you get pushback, you know you're on the right track.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions or reflections that they would like to share? Alexandra, yes, do you want to ask a question?
Hi, I also have questions to Dr. Ogada. I read your book, and now I'm writing my master thesis because I was very, very inspired by it. So I'm in Nairobi now to do interviews with different people, including people from ICRAF and of those colonialist organizations. And I have questions for you because you're focusing on NRT in your book, the Northern Range Trust. So I'm wondering if there's any relationship between the LabSet corridor and the NRT. And also there's that European Union funded Regreening Africa project, and it's on the same area as the Northern Rangeland Trust, and it seems that both exclude pastoralists. So is there any connection between these two programs, because both are sponsored by the EU also? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. The LabSet, for those who don't know, it's an infrastructure project that that includes a railway line, pipeline, and roads that's meant to connect South Sudan and Ethiopia to the port of Lamu, which is in the northern part of the Kenyan coast. The LAPSET program, it's sort of unraveled a bit because there were challenges with the oil exploration, which was meant, the oil discovered in northern Kenya, which was a major driver for it, turned out not to be that big or viable. So, and then Ethiopia also made peace with Eritrea, so they got access to the port through Eritrea since then. So it's slowed down and it's not really happening. But the Regreening Africa program, it's a problem. It's a problem because it doesn't include local input, and there's a lot parts of it that stretch right across the Sahel, even West Africa, where they're actively planting trees, etc. And the Sahara is a natural desert. It's a natural desert. It's an arid environment. It's not a desert created by anybody. So they're trying to roll back nature or impose control of nature by doing experiments, which also have they bring imbalances in the natural ecosystems. In NRT, they're even doing something which is called Northern Rangelands Grassland Carbon Project, where they're even cutting down certain species of trees and planting grass. And when you cut down trees, giraffes have to eat from trees, camels have to eat from trees, elephants as well. These are animals that can't eat grass very well. So we are creating imbalances in nature. And this is a part of the colonialism. And they're simply doing it because somebody gave money to do it. There's no scientific basis for what they're trying to do. It's just an adventure because someone's financing it. And when the money dries up or the billionaire gets bored of this adventure, then it just ends. That's the problem.
Okay, thank you very much. But why do you think Sweden and Denmark are investing in the Northern Rangeland Trust?
This is it's not just Sweden, Denmark, France, UK, and USA as well. It's because there is Kenya. It's geopolitics, global politics. It's LAPSET and a lot of infrastructure development in East Africa was actually financed by China. So the way to push back against infrastructure development is to create protected areas. And that's why they're investing in creating these conservancies. So if now you want to build a road, you're told this is a conservancy, you can't build a road here. That's what I think. It's a way of pushing back against China's influence, because there is nothing that NRT is doing that deserves that much investment. I mean, USA alone is $20 million. I think Sweden is maybe 5-6 million euros or something. It's huge amounts of money. And if you go on the ground there's nothing they're doing that's worth that money. So I think it's global politics at play.
Okay, last short question, because the EU is also investing in LAPSET, both in LAPSET and the carbon grassland project. So that's sort of against that what you said.
The EU is a really confused organization right now. I don't think they know what they're doing anywhere. Yeah, there's very little logic in things that the EU is doing. I mean, you can even see the sort of confusion they're going through in Europe now with Russia and taking gas supplies from Russia, while at the same time pretending to be against Russia. And so the EU suffers a lot right now from that lack of proper logical strategic direction. And I think it's the same thing. They thought maybe they thought having a stake in LAPSET is good, because especially if there's oil, if there's an oil pipeline, politically it's viable to have a stake in that. But at the same time, maybe they're playing both sides of the fence, so you win something regardless which side loses.
Okay, thank you very much.
Welcome.
We'll have some time for some more questions if anybody would like to ask either of the speaker. If not, I have several questions of my own that I would like to ask. Because I think, as I mentioned earlier, I was really taken by the emphasis on capital, and this was framed as a conversation on coloniality. But of course, as we know, historically, race and capital are inherently entwined. But I think what struck me most from both talks really was the changing expression of capital and its relationship with colonialism. So maybe to leave that as a broad point to invite both Tete and Dr. Ogada to maybe reflect on their two presentations and maybe just talk a little bit about that link between coloniality and capital. Maybe Tete, you could go first. I think it was something that you brought up first in your presentation. Maybe how you see those two things relating in regard to water, if you could just expand on that a little bit more.
Thanks, Alex. So I think I'll just prefix by saying that the harsh reality that is being discussed today, which is speaking honestly, it's not about a nudge against sustainability. It's actually in favor of sustainability, asking for greater inclusivity, right? So when we look at capital and water, it's something similar that's happening whereby corporations are only thinking of their own profit margins and they're not including the thoughts of the local people, right? So where, for instance, some of these companies move to, where it's prime water locations, where the communities living there, how are those communities impacted? Is there dumping of waste happening there, right? So also the entire ecosystem of exploitation, capitalistic exploitation. So what are they producing? They're producing beers, which have an effect on people's mental health and on people's physical health. But in turn, they're also consuming from the lands where people used to graze, where people used to, at the same time, produce their livelihoods, because now they're producing cash crops to supply to these corporations. So it's about saying there's a big opportunity in this sustainability discourse now, whereby, using the example of Dr. Ogada, fences don't work anymore to blockade people away in China, for instance. So what is the new innovation that can be used? So what is being proposed is to say, can we allow people at the grassroots level to be able to enter the conversation and give their perspectives and be able to give also their experiences so that capital can be able to accommodate us better, so that sustainability can be able to innovate as well, to be more inclusive, and at the same time then for us to have more positive, well-intended solutions. So I think that's what the key thing that my talk was about. And I think also what Dr. Ogada is saying, that Africans want to participate in sustainability, but what type of sustainability? Not one whereby the North is benefiting, but then the South is being further detrimented.
Yeah, yes, I'm full agreement with that, and this is why I said also we need to look closely also at the humanities, because you won't find any conservation biologists who talk like I do, because most of them don't study history. But if you look at history, you will realize that colonialism was a capitalist exercise. Imperialism and the sort of ownership of countries came later. But the first people who went to India or Africa were people who went for They went there for timber, ivory, gold, whatever. Excuse me. So they were capitalists, and there was the British East India Company that was running India. There was the British Imperial British East Africa Company that was running Kenya. So these were capitalist organizations. There's a period when Congo, the whole of Congo belonged to King Leopold. It was private property. And that's when he unleashed brutality on the people there in order to collect rubber, ivory, and other things. So capitalism has always been behind this. And it's even behind politics. And now, when we look at the global environmental crisis, it is not because of human population. It is because of human behavior, i.e. consumption patterns. And that is why the United States, with a population of, I think, 270 million people, consumes more than India with 1.54 billion people. That's why it's their consumption patterns. It's not about the number of people. So we need to understand that capitalism is the cause of the global environmental crisis or climate change. So capitalism cannot be the savior. When you create financial tools and capitalist tools like carbon trading, they cannot be the savior. They are the problem. Capitalists are the problem. Jeff Bezos needs to organize Amazon's operations to become environmentally sustainable instead of giving $2 billion to the nature conservers. That's what it should be. Warren Buffett should push the companies he's invested in to make it streamline their operations and make them environmentally friendly instead of buying up a chunk of Congo. So capitalism is now hiding. And we are to blame because we in the science and conservation are partly to blame because we pushed the crisis narrative and marketed it so successfully that now, if you are rich, instead of changing your behavior, just give a scientist some money. And this happened in the last 20 years or so. When I was doing my master's research 20 years or so ago, it was difficult to get grants. You'd write a lot of proposals, get $5,000 here, $3,000 here and there. But right now, scientists are getting $200,000 grants to individuals. Organizations are like Alexandra mentioned, Northern Rangelands Trust. They've got $20 million US just for that one organization. And this is a problem. We become beholden to capitalism. If a company that has got X amount from oil companies, from people like Bezos, from Gates Foundation, and all these other capitalists, they cannot say anything against capitalism. They'll go around talking about carbon trading, etc., and talk about greenwashing through the PR and communication. So it's important that we understand capitalism, what it is, and then this strange thing we call sustainability. We must realize that sustainability is a much more complex thing than we think. Sustainability has to be environmental, social, political, ethical, legal, and all that. It does not do anything. It doesn't help anything when Tesla is so proud that they have electric cars and kids are dying in mines to produce coltan for those cars. That's not sustainable. So I think we need to understand sustainability and interrogate it. When someone says, oh, this is a very sustainable, you have to ask, sustainable in what way? I mean, it's a subjective term. If you say Mordecai is lovable, God, what does that mean even? So it means different things to different people. So you cannot say that something's sustainable without qualifying that. But right now we are not qualifying it. We are talking about sustainability goals. Even the UN and governments are using the term sustainability very carelessly. Like someone has a question here about the Seychelles. Yeah, feel free, you can ask that.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Yeah, it's a very specific, possibly selfish question about the animal system I'm studying in the Seychelles. So about 50 years ago, in an island in the Seychelles, there was this bird which nearly went extinct. And since then, the island has been purchased by BirdLife International, which is, I think, a company based in Cambridge and UK. And then it was turned into a nature reserve to restore the habitat for that bird, which nearly went extinct, and the other species on the island. And following that, a really long-term project by 3 Western universities studying that one bird which nearly went extinct has been set up to understand evolution and ecology. And I'm actually doing a PhD studying that particular bird, using it to understand the conservation genetics of inbreeding, so mating between related individuals. And we essentially, people have been collecting data for the past 30 years on that one bird. And the Western universities that I work for pay rent to go and take samples of the bird, so blood samples and other measurements, twice a year for 2 months at a time. So we're there about 4 to 5 months per year. And the island as a nature reserve is now managed by a company owned by a local Seychelles person, but under the sort of same sort of restrictions that BirdLife International imposed, which is where only really tourists who can afford to pay a fee are allowed to land. So my question is just if such a research project is suitable in the long term, where we go out for 5 months every year and take samples of this one bird, and if that, do you think that's
the short answer is no, because what you've described is a business. What's going on in that island is a business.
Mm-hmm.
It is earning money from that bird. I mean, obvious studies like what you're doing, the effects of inbreeding, that's very important in the biology of conservation, the Ali effect and all that. But there was a real crisis, and crises actually attract tons of money. You may have heard the myth of the northern white rhino, which is somewhere here in Olpejeta in Kenya. They said there was only one male left. I'm saying it's a myth because there's some left in the wild in South Sudan. And once that male left, a $9 million project has been launched to do in vitro fertilization with sperm harvested from that male. And the females they're looking at using are actually the daughters of that male. That's ridiculous. No species can survive, even livestock, you can't rear like that. But they're raising raised $9 million for it. And they're going to do it. So it makes good business sense, but not any conservation or sustainability sense. And when you end up with part of a sovereign state belonging to a company or an organization, that's what Leopold did in Congo back in the day. It's simple as that. It's okay, you're not killing people or anything like Leopold, but the legality of owning part of another country. And the Nature Conservancy has also done some agreement where they own the entire 210,000 square kilometers of seascape around the Seychelles, and they control who can do oil exploration or whatever, anything there. And this is the problem. That's the definition of colonialism. That's how it happens. And there's a lot of ethical problems there, but everyone says we've conserved this bird, which is true. But this is why we have to step back and look at what are we really doing. That bird can survive. Okay, we've done what we need to do to conserve that bird. If the numbers are too small, hopefully, whatever your study finds out, if those numbers are too small to have hybrid vigor to survive, then we lose it. That's the bottom line. We've had a lot of extinctions, particularly in Europe and the West. That would be one of a few that happened in the tropics. But what they are putting together there as a sort of sustainable research project is actually a business. And that's not sustainable, because that's what really defines colonialism. There's some Seychellois person who may desire to go visit that island, and he simply can't go because he can't pay enough for bad life to let him go, or he can't pay what is required of a tourist, yet he isn't. So those are the ethical challenges. Even as you do, so it's the sort of what I was saying, it's important for students to understand, even as you do your science, keep an eye on those things and internally deal with it, so that when you come face to face with questions around it, you sort of be ready. Yeah, but that's a very good illustration of what I was saying, and I'm glad you understand it in that way.
Mm.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question, which we have in the chat. So this is from Chiwe, and this is to both speakers. Where is the body of knowledge on this being accommodated, either in academia or spaces of policy implementation? And what are the conditions we need to foster that will enable us to transition to sustainability approaches that decenter imperialism? So quite a big question, but I think one that does encompass the conversation from today.
Yes.
I'll
Tete,
take that
go
one.
ahead. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I'll take that one too for now, just to say thank you for that question, Shu, and also thank you to African Voices platform, which really does a good job of shining a light on a lot of topical African issues. So I think on my part, Chiwe, I see that there are many sustainability centers, institutes, organizations that actually have a big opportunity here to be able to say, and one of the fundamental things that I think Dr. Ogada highlighted was the ethics that is being removed from this sustainability rush. So sustainability has become a corporate tool in itself. It's become marketing. And what I think Dr. Ogada is saying is now it's very difficult for us, well, how I rather should say how I'm understanding it. It's becoming very difficult for us to tell the difference between who is well-intended and who's just coming to Africa and other global south spaces to make money. So the resistance actually doesn't come from the organizations that are truly doing good. The resistance comes
Tete, if you can
so
hear
there's
us,
a
Tete, just to let you know, we lost you slightly there.
Hi, am I back on?
Yes, you're back on.
Yes,
Thank
you're
you.
back.
Yeah. Thank you. So that is what has been highlighted here. So it's not a name and shame or blame game. It's about saying, can the West please start hearing our African voices of what some of these organizations, some of these corporations are doing, so that sustainability has a true voice. So this is not an attack on sustainability or any of these other features of it, but rather one of saying it's become too saturated, it's muddy. So who are the true seekers? Who is the real sustainability? And this is why there's a space also for academia to develop a stream of allowing scholars who talk, critical sustainability scholars, let's call them, who are coming in as warriors and soldiers of sustainability to say, we are going to help put a defense wall to say who is a true sustainability organization and who is just coming to cause more problems that will need to be resolved or maybe will never be able to be resolved. That's my standpoint, Chiwe. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Right now, it's pretty scattered. Even me personally, that was the reasoning behind my decision to set up my personal blog and websites where I can curate my work. There's an organization based in Germany called EOTO, EOTO. It's an acronym for each one, teach one, that's doing a lot of sort of decolonial work right across the spectrum, not just in research. But it's important, anybody, your thoughts, your writings on this, put them down, put them up. The internet is a wonderful space. Even that, it's even giving us space to meet and talk like this. So put them up there. Let people see it. Put it on social media. Use these tools, because the reach of social media in Africa is beyond what anyone. Literally, social media will change Africa. That's what's changing Africa. It's not wars and investments in democracy and NGOs and that kind of thing. It's social media and data. So let's make use of these spaces, and we need to recognize that the problem is our inability to manage capitalism from an individual to institutional level. And this is what I mean. A good student, PhD student, brilliant student, finish a brilliant thesis. The first thing you go and do, you apply for grants to do research, and some capitalist organization recognize you, Bill Gates Foundation recognizes you, and they hit you with $1 million. You're gone. You're gone as far as intellectual freedom is concerned. Universities are getting funding from capitalists, but universities are not managing this funding properly. A capitalist giving $5 million to Sheffield University, for example, it's great. That's great. It will help the university. But universities should not channel this funding towards programs. So they say this $5 million is towards the chair, pays for the chairmanship of the Department of Ecology. And maybe the $5 million is from Shell. No student will be able to write a thesis about the harmful effects of oil drilling because his department is funded by Shell. But if the university just took the money and used it within its networks discretionary, and you thank Shell for their funding, but you don't let Shell fund a department chair. It gets so bad because these capitalists don't fund anyone out of love. Capitalists by nature are selfish, aggressive people. So they want something. We must realize they want something. So that's why we must not stop taking the grants, but we take it at you give me this discretionary money. Look at the agreement, communicate about them. If necessary, refuse it. So we mustn't just say, yes, I give you the money, because otherwise capitalists, they'll own all of us and we'll end up in trouble. So that's the thing. We must keep our compass. We must keep the communication lines open. And even those in universities, talk to your institution and tell them, tell them how suggest ways in which they can manage and negotiate this minefield of capitalism, because we can't do without capitalism. That's a fact. And we can't kill them all. So we have to live with them. But we mustn't let them completely have their way. Your money can get you this far. You can fund the university, but not a department, not a chair, not a program. So our institutions have a long way to go, but for us as individual scholars, yes, seek those research grants, but be careful with them. Have dialogue with whoever supports your work. And that's you build yourself as an individual. And hopefully, whoever supports your work will also learn something from your quality.
Thank you. I'm afraid to say we have to draw today's conversation to a close. I could keep listening to you both speak for ages. This has been super insightful. And your comments on academia in particular, I think, leave us with a lot to think about, particularly those of us based in the UK. And when I started the introduction, I was talking about connecting the local to the international. And I think your focus on how funding works really does speak to a local situation we have in Sheffield. But clearly also speaks to the most macro of lenses as well, in terms of billionaires funding things going on in Africa. So that connection is really clear. And so thank you for providing that and for reinforcing why this was a really important conversation to have. So thank you both, and thank you to everyone for joining us this afternoon. It's been great to have you here today.
My pleasure.
Thank you. So that's it. Thanks everyone. Take care, and please join us for the next Centre Online event when we advertise it. Thank you very much.
Good day. Bye.